All right, everybody. Today we're going to go over backend APIs. The lesson points for the day, we're going to be exploring the Noun project. We'll be talking about backend APIs versus front-end APIs, or I guess why you would use an API through the backend instead of the front end, and then conducting API requests with Django. We'll be working over Django templates and setting up our Django projects along with the application. We'll be working with the Python library request and request auth lib. And then we'll be using Prettier to kind of clean up the way we'll be able to see the API coming back, the API response coming back to us. And then we're going to go over hiding and loading our secret keys using python.env. So here's the Noun project. If you guys go on Google and just look up the Noun project, it'll be the first one that pops up. Click on it. Basically, all it does is it has small icons for anything that is a noun. So if you click on the API here, it tells you how to do things with your API. You can go into create and manage your API. I've already created an account for us that we'll be using today. Click on it. And then this API and specifically, just know I'll be regenerating these keys. So please don't copy and paste them or try to use them for anything else. These keys are going to be our secret key. So we have our secret key and then we have our API key. Both of them are specifically designed to be used by us or the specific user who creates this API. And it's important to annotate when your APIs have keys like that. For example, I believe you guys have already used the Pokemon API, right?
Yes.
Okay. So with the Pokemon API, we didn't have any keys at all. All we had to do was ping this URL and the database would spit out all this information back to us, right? Now with the Noun API, we're going to need to actually include these keys. And so we see here that we have an actual limitation on how many times we can call this API, right? Some APIs will actually start charging you if you start going over that limit, or there's other APIs that could actually do specific things that you don't want people out there just being able to do with your credentials. When you use a front-end API, you're actually exposing this URL when you send that request. And if you have all of those keys exposed in your front end, somebody could go into your console, maybe go into your network tab and see how the API call is being sent. And they can look at the credentials and extract those keys from your API calls. So once they extract those keys, they can basically use the API acting as you. Get any cumulative charges would go to you. And this is why anything that comes with keys, you always want to hit from the back end. Right? This way it's always secure and we want to make, and no one has the ability to access these things. So the back end is anything in our Django server, and Django will hide those keys for us. And we'll go over how to hide them with our .env later on in the lesson. Something really important when it comes to this thing, you can't just go into an API and expect to be able to use it right away. You want to make sure that you look at the docs, right? Most APIs that are pretty user-friendly have a getting started section. And in the getting started section, they'll talk about the different things that you can encounter. For example, I believe you guys have already gone over HTTP responses and what each one of them means. So they go here a little bit more in depth, what type of errors you should be expecting if you see anything. If you get a 401 unauthorized, that means that these keys weren't valid when you try to pass them in, or the way you try to pass them in were incorrect. 404 just means it wasn't found, et cetera, et cetera. And then they're even nice enough to provide us a sample code in Python. So we see here that they use the request library, then they use the request auth lib library, and then they have it perfectly commented out where you grab your API key and then replace it with your secret key. And then they give you the endpoint specifically that you can use. And we know that this endpoint could either be an integer or it could be a word at the end, right? So this one is the variable that we're going to be changing depending on what we receive. Then we have our response, and we see that it uses the request library. It sends a GET request to this endpoint and then sends our authentication towards the end of the endpoint. And then finally, we could print the content of the response, because if we just print the response, we'll just see the HTTP object, which will more than likely be a 200 or 401, etc. Now, once we actually go into the content of the object, that's when we'll see our dictionary or array of dictionaries of what's actually inside of this API. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, great. So if that makes sense. Why would you want to use a backend API, or why would you want to ping an API from the backend instead of a front end?
You don't typically want the users to see either one, you might, depending on how it's set up, it might accidentally carry a token or sensitive information, but two, user doesn't need to see it, it's UX. So all that backend stuff is in the back.
Yeah, perfect. So the main thing to just keep in mind is just authentication and security, right? The backend will give us that ability, whereas front-end API will happen on the user session, and it won't need either of those variables. All right, perfect. So now that we have explored the Noun API, I can show you guys what we're planning on building today. So this is what we'll be building today. We have the Noun project. There's just a simple Django page. If I put car into that form, it sends me to the next page, which is item in a different URL. We see that the item I searched for was car, and then the response from our API will give us an icon image and we'll display it on our Django template. All right, before I get started, does anybody have any questions? Perfect. All right, so let's get into the coding part. So here we have an empty directory. I'm going to go ahead and create my env. I'm going to activate the env file. All right, so now that it's activated, I can install Django. All right, and then I'm just going to upgrade my page real quick so I can start seeing that warning message. Okay, so now I have Django. So now I could run Django admin, start project, and then I'll call it Noun project. So we see that we have our Noun project now that's been created. So in the terminal, I can cd into the Noun project. Inside of the Noun project, and I'm going to need a static directory. And I'm also going to need to start an app. Okay, so now we see the Noun app has populated. We see our Noun project, and we see our static files. So let's go into our settings, install our application, and create our static files directory. So here we're going to have the Noun app. And then we want to make sure that we always end things with a comma. We'll scoot down, we see static files URLs, and we'll go into static. And I believe this was already covered. Does anyone have any questions over what this means or what this is doing?
Yeah, could you please remind?
Say again.
Could you please go through it again?
Yeah, of course. So basically all this is doing, this is our static URL, and Django, whenever you try to ping anything that's coming from a static folder, when you give it, it's going to reference this specific line in your settings. And it's going to know that it's going to be looking for a library named static or a directory named static. And then here we have static file directory. So we're telling it that anything in reference to this project will be inside of the base directory of static. So it's going to be looking inside of this folder for anything that we have in static files. Does that answer everything? Clear it up?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. And everyone knows what this does as well, right? The installed apps. Okay, fantastic. So now that we have that included, now we're just going to go ahead and grab our URLs from our application. And then here we're going to do the Noun app URLs. All right. Now that we have that, we can close our settings and our URLs. And here what we're going to do is we're going to make the file of the URLs in the Noun app. So now we see that the URLs file has populated. Click here, and then I believe it's from Django URLs, it's path, perfect. So we have URL patterns. We're going to do that, and we will use, we're going to give it a name of, so right now it's telling me that there's no such thing as views. So I'll have to import that as well. So you don't need static folders inside the app directory. No, your static folder should be outside of the app directory. So we create the Noun project. After we create our project, we should see both the project and the application. And inside of that same parent folder, we should see static. Templates will have to be inside of the application because each individual application will have its own templates. Good.
And is that because both the project and the app individually might need to access stuff in the static one, so you don't want it inside one of them?
Yeah, so when you go into your static, if you have multiple applications, I believe last time, let me see. So last time what you guys did is you guys just went static and then created a CSS folder, right? And then inside of the CSS folder, you put that CSS file. If you have multiple apps in the same project, instead of naming it CSS, you would name it the name of the application. That way you know what static files belong to each individual application. And when you go to link them in your templates, you can call them by the parent folder.
Cool.
Awesome.
Sorry, before creating the URLs .py, what did you do in settings? I just missed that part.
Oh yeah, of course. Let me check it out again. So in settings, we brought in the Noun app, put it under installed apps. And then after that, we scroll down to where we see our static URL, where reference static, and then we give it our static file directory, which is going to be the base directory and static.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
No problem at all. So that takes care of that. All right. So I'll continue from where we left off. And we have path, views, home. All right. So right now, views isn't really doing anything. There's no such thing as the view of home. So let's make that. It's going to take in request as an argument. And we're just going to return render. And then request is the first argument there. After that, we're going to give it the name of the template. So we'll go pages. And then template itself, which will be, let's go with home.html. All right. So right now we don't have a template that exists for that. So let me check our directory. So now we want to click here, and then we're going to make the template directory inside of the Noun app. So templates. So now we see templates populated. And now we're going to be making a pages folder inside of templates. And now we could create the home HTML file inside of templates. Sorry, inside of the pages directory. Perfect. So now we see that home HTML populate. Now we can just start with some regular HTML. Oh, thank you. All right, so in the head, All we're gonna give it is a title. And we'll just call it the Noun Project. We'll bring in the body, and the body will have a header. I close that off. All right, perfect. So just to clarify what's going to be happening, once we actually launch the server, it's going to go into our URLs. It's going to see that we're going to be in an empty path. So it's going to reference the Noun app URLs. So go to the Noun app URLs, see that we have the views.home. So after that, it'll reference our views. And upon request of this view, it's going to return render the pages home.html. So this is what we should actually see on our terminal once we run it. So I believe that's the correct stuff. So let's see what we got here. Oh, sorry. We're gonna migrate so we don't see all that warning stuff. Have you guys gone over migrations yet by any chance?
We've seen migrations a few times. Can you go over again why, what is it doing?
Yeah, so basically Django comes with a bunch of built-in data structures and things that you could use when you're actually using a database. And when you migrate, it's actually creating a database. So unfortunately, it won't let you look at the database. So this DB stands for database and then SQLite. Basically, this is just a built-in database that you could use with Django in case you don't want to use Postgres, which I believe you guys used last week, right? Okay, yeah. So later on, you guys will learn how to hook up Postgres to your Django application. And once you run these migrations, all of this is going to create separate data tables inside of your database.
And then Django's just using those data tables, in the background.
Right. So Django's just going to be using these tables in the background for different things that you want to use. So for example, they have here like a user email stuff, the user email things that you can use. They have login entry, built-in things that you can use. It's just a lot of built-in things that go into authentication with Django. Awesome. All right, so now I'm going to actually run the server. So there's the server running, and if I load this, we see welcome to backend APIs. Perfect. So now I know this is working correctly. I'm actually seeing my index HTML. Now let's connect some static stuff here. So we have our static. We're going to make a main CSS. And a main JS. So now when I open up static, we see CSS and JavaScript. Nice. So here in my home, I'm going to actually connect them in the head portion. So now we'll go link, and actually inside here, we want load static. Perfect. Have we gone over this already? What load static means and what it does?
I'd say no, not load static in HTML.
Okay, perfect. So load static is actually going to be telling the page that it's going to be looking for static files here. And it's just going to allow you to use the static tag. So here, let me see. It says to there you go. And then I'll drop this on the chat. So there's the link in the chat. It goes over how the static file finder works in Django and why the static file stirrers is important, and how it works with templates and how to set up your folder structure inside of static. So for example, earlier when I was talking about in static, how you would name a different folder, the name of your application. So instead of CSS, this would be the noun app, and then it would have the main CSS inside of it. But since this project only has one application, I named it CSS and JS. And then it goes over how to link it correctly. So here we see that we want to add it into our index HTML. So we have the load static tag, which is basically going to tell the template that it's going to be referencing a static file. So now when Django renders, it tells the static finder inside of Django that it's going to be pulling something from inside the static folder. That was a lot of loops. Is everybody okay with that explanation?
I just want to, you were telling Django that you're going to be looking at static files. And how is that different than just loading the path to the static file?
Okay, perfect. So there is no difference. I could technically manually load it, right? But if I want to reference this specific style sheet from other folders, let's say I have different folders like pages and components inside of my templates, and I want to be able to address it from within my HTML component, the way I would have to map the path would be different for each one of the templates. Whereas if I just use the static tag, I could just use this small difference of an href right here, where it's just going to know that it's going to static and then grabbing the specific style sheet in every single template without having to change the file path. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's a shortcut. Got it.
Perfect. All right. So now link, we have the relationship, which is just a style sheet. And then we have the href. Here we're going to use static. And in there, we're going to use CSS / main.css. And then we see that it's red. So it's telling me that there's something wrong. That's because it's all supposed to be under quotation marks, right? So we have the double quotation marks on the outside and then single quotation marks on the inside for the file path. All right, now I'm just going to close it. And then is this a good screen size for everybody, or would it benefit everyone if I just kind of close this and then switch screens between it? Okay, perfect. So now we have the style sheet located, but I have no proof that it's actually working. So I'm just gonna go ahead and make it small CSS change, and I'm just gonna make the color blue. Okay. Ooh, so it seems like it didn't actually work. I'm gonna say, oh, that probably explains why. So I wasn't running the server. All right, now if I run the server, we see welcome to backend APIs in blue. Perfect. So now in JS, I'm gonna go ahead and go back to my home, bring in my script tag. And I believe for this one, we will use an SRC actually for source rather than href, right? Let me make sure. Right. So in this SRC, same thing, we'll use the static. And what I'm going to load is going to be my JS, main.js. Now I just got to close my script tag. Perfect, server's running. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh it, and we see I'm connected, don't worry, from main.js. Perfect. Does anyone have any questions over how we connected or CSS and our JS to our template? Okay. Oh, thank you. All right, so now we have our templates, we have our pages, and now let's move forward. Let's kind of clean up a little bit of the things that we have open here. I want to make sure that I'm not looking at anything that I do not need. All right. And we have this. All right, so now I'm going to show you guys how we're going to extend this so that we could use it with different pages, and this will never change. The only thing that will change will be the content inside. So we have this main. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a block, and I'm going to call it content. I like to open them up just so that I know that they're there. And in that block content is where I'm going to use everything that I need to use. So now I'm going to create a form, a noun form HTML. So let me see. Touch, now, templates, pages. All right, and then I'm also going to need an item temp page. Okay, so now we see we have home, item, and noun. Perfect. So now let's extend this home to everything else. So we're going to use the extends keyword. And there it's going to be asking me what is it that I want to extend. So I'm going to tell it that I want to extend pages, HTML. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that block content. All right, and inside of this block content, this is where I'm going to actually put my form. I'm going to put an input field, type text. And I'm going to give it a name of item. And then now we need an input field. This one's going to be type submit. I'm going to give it a value of, I don't know, I guess look. That will work. And now I'll finally just close the form. All right, so basically all this is saying is when I render this form, or when I actually call the render in this form, it's going to reference the home HTML. So it references the home HTML, it sees the block content, just like I have it here. So now instead of this block being blank, it's going to replace the insides of this block content with what I have here in the noun form. Does that work with everyone? All right, so let's make sure it works before we move forward too far. Oh, probably should change that in my views, huh? Okay, so we see the welcome to the backend APIs, and there we have our form with the input field and our button, which is an input field type submit, and it says with the value of look. All right, perfect. So now what I want, this form actually has to do a couple of things. It has to be able to take in the input, and it's going to send a post request over to a separate URL. And then we have to be able to actually grab that input out of that. So let's mess with forms in HTML. So here we can have method. And then I just went over the method. It's going to be post. And we're going to give this an action. And in the action, what we want it to do is we want it to post to item. That's going to be the URL that we'll be using. All right. Now, let's go. We're going to need to go into our URLs. Create that path name. All right, so tell me there's a problem. The problem is that item currently doesn't exist. So let's bring that in. And we're going to render the request. And we want to render the pages. Item HTML. Nice. So now item HTML doesn't have anything. So let's extend again. And what's supposed to go inside these quotation marks?
Supposed to link to the home HTML. But I actually had a quick question about that. When you put do you need to put pages/home, or because it's in the same directory, can you just put home.html to link them?
I believe you have to use pages/home because anytime you reference any type of template, so extends know that you're referencing any type of template, right? It's going to go into the templates folder, and that's as far as what Django will do for you. It gets you into the templates folder, but then after that, you have to specify that it also has to go into pages and then grab the individual template from pages. Awesome. All right, so now we have our pages. And then now I need to open up some sort of block. Does anyone remember what's supposed to be in that block?
There's another
No.
block content.
Yes. And then, sorry, just to answer your question, Daniel, the point of having a pages is because sometimes, so pages is supposed to be an entire HTML page, right? But let's say you want to create different components or different parts of the HTML that are going to be changing each time. You could create a components folder, or let's say that you want to create something specific. Like if we were making a Pokemon application and you want to make Pokemon cards, then you could name it card folder or different cards, and then have different HTMLs in there. Okay, perfect. I'm glad that answered it because I was about to go down a rabbit hole. Yes, and then block content. Yeah, so this is definitely I guess kind of like React, where you're working with components. I'm using the word components to try to make it relatable to React. But yes, it will make more sense once you guys see it that way. And then let's just give this an H3 of item. Okay, so now we know this is what's going to actually show up inside of the block. This form will take me over to the URL that I'm telling it to do. So let me go over that. So this form, once I run the action, it's going to send this post method of everything that's inside of the form into this URL. And then this URL will actually render it as well. So it goes to the URL of item. So here we have item. Then we tell it that it's going to be using views item. I'm naming everything the same thing to make it easily relatable. Is it confusing, or is it actually making sense to just name everything the same thing?
It's making sense to me, at least.
Okay, perfect. So once it goes into item, it's going to go into the rendering of the pages of item HTML. I'll go into the HTML, grab the block content, and we'll see item being displayed there. All right, so let's see what happens when we send it. So we put car here and I submit it. So we see that it tried to send a post. But something happened here. There was some sort of error, or something didn't actually work correctly. So here we see that it tried to send a GET request for item where it's equal to car, but it didn't actually go through correctly. So the problem with it is that there's a CSRF token that hasn't been given to this. So now if I give it a CSRF token, it's just going to give it permissions to actually interact with my web page. Now, if I put car, it actually sends me to the next template. We see that the URL changes into item, and we could see the H3 of item being displayed.
Can you go over a little bit about what that token is? Like, why do we need it? What does it do?
Yeah, so I believe that is going to be in our application tab. And let me look for it here. Here it is. All right. So inside of your application tab, basically any time that an HTML or anything that in the front end is trying to send any type of request to the back end, especially post and delete request, I believe the ones that it will let you conduct without any type of token will only be get request. If you try to run any other type of request, it's going to ask you for permissions, right? So since we're doing this all from Django, we could just give the template itself a CSRF token inside of the form, so that whenever the method of post gets sent and the Django can ask, whoa, you're trying to send me a post request, but you don't have permissions, the form can say, hey, you gave me a CSRF token, you got to let me in, lets the form in, takes the information, and sends it over to the view. Does that answer your question?
Probably. I will probably have more questions when I try and use it, or if something breaks, but for now, that's good.
Okay, perfect.
Where in the request is that CSRF token? Is it going to be like the header or something?
Where in the request is it going?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually included in the header. So when you send the post request, it's going to ask for any type of authentication, and they'll be able to identify that the CSRF token is in there. I wonder if I could find the request from here. I'll have to look around and see if I could find the request from here. But I will do that after the class so that I'm not using up your guys' time. But just know that that CSRF token is just basically giving you access and permission to work with the backend server. Cool.
So 2 questions. What's the security implication of having that there, if any? And 2, we were kind of introduced to this very, very like briefly and vaguely. But they, instead of using the token there, he wrapped the view function in an API view wrapper that was imported from somewhere. And it like negated the need to put the CSRF token there.
Okay, perfect. So as far as I know, you guys haven't worked with Django REST frameworks yet.
No.
Yeah, so that's where that API view comes in. So the Django REST frameworks brings in API view, and you can give API views such a thing as a CSRF exempt, or you could where you're telling it, hey, this specific view is not going to need any type of authentication. Just forget about it and let it do what it does. And it's also going to be able to specify what type of methods you're going to be able to access that individual view, whether it's a get, delete, et cetera, et cetera. Since you guys aren't, as far as I know, that material hasn't been officially covered by an instructor yet. What we'll be using for now to build our application with backend will be the CSRF token. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, it did. But what is, if any, like, I don't know, is there any kind of like negative security implications of just like putting that there? Does it matter? It's not really authenticating, like, I don't know, anything sensitive, I guess. It's just saying, hey, you're allowed to talk to me.
Yeah, so basically all this is doing is stopping anybody from being able to, I guess, try to run any type of random request from the front end. So someone can actually go into the console tab and kind of create their own request that they want to send to the back end, and then try to send it from their front end or the interaction that they have with their front end template. With you giving the CSRF tokens explicitly to the form here, it knows that only that form has permissions, right? So if anybody else tries to change things around and send any other type of information through another type of a form or other method, whether that be Axios, et cetera, they won't be able to do it because it won't have the actual permissions that you gave it through the CSRF token. And they won't be able to access the CSRF token because it's coming, it's coming from the back end. So they won't be able to replicate it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Of course. Awesome. All right, so now we see that item showed up, everything's working well, but we're not actually getting the input of what we put here, right? We have car here. So now let's try to extract that from our request. So let's put item title here. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab it from the request, because once we sent the post method here, that means that it is actually inside of the request itself, and we could grab it now. So we can go request, specify the method that was sent, and then the information that I want to get out of there. So in this case, it'll be item. And then let me just kind of break that down a little bit more. So we send a post request, right? So in our view, we know that inside of the request is inside of post. Inside of that post request, we have this input field that we named item. And we want the value of this input field. So that's what we're going to actually get. So we go into the post method, and then we use the get function to grab the item specifically from there. So now I'm going to print it. Is it the same as an auth token? It is not the same as an auth token. You guys will go over token. Well, we will go over tokens a little bit more in depth once we actually start messing with authentication and including React. And I'll do a better job of breaking it down next time for everybody. All right, so now we see we're gonna put car in here. And when we send it, we actually see it being printed. All right. Does everyone understand how we were able to send that from the form? Okay, perfect. So in that case, I want you guys to tell me how to grab the actual item title from that post request.
Can we see the HTML?
Yeah, of course. Do you want the HTML from the form? Sorry.
What do you mean by item title?
So I want to know what exactly it is that I'm putting in that input field.
Okay.
Oh, I'm running into a problem. Yeah. So what is it that I'm putting into this input field, right? How do I grab it from my views?
Isn't there like a form, like request dot form get or something like that? I don't know the syntax.
Yeah. So it's going to be
There's a method in there that lets you get. Yeah.
perfect. So we call the request. We want to specify the method that
type,
was used.
right.
Yeah. So it was post. And then after that, we'll just get it by the title or the name that we gave to that input field, right? So now here, let's say maybe Mexico, right? We see item and we see Mexico here on our server. Awesome. So now we have our item title. And now what we can actually do is start working with the backend API so that we can start seeing this information. And then you guys have already worked with data. Can you guys tell me how I could send this item title over to the front end?
Need to, I was gonna say, basically edit into a dictionary, I think is what we were doing.
All right, so we see data. All right, so I now have a dictionary.
You just do the key title as quotes, item underscore title, and then value of item title.
All right, and then how do I pass it to the template?
In that render function, you'll just add it as a third argument after that .html.
Okay, is there anything else I need to do to be able to see it? So
Well,
let me
that's
try
going to
it.
pass the whole object. So you'll have to access the item title.
Okay, how do I do that?
You do the
Yeah, it's like
double
brackets.
double brackets. Yeah, and then what was the key item title?
Okay, so let's see. Perfect. So now we see item title showing up. Nice. So now we're working with data, we're getting all that information there. And now we could finally include our API call. So now we're going to be working with a couple of things. So we'll be working with request, we'll be working with reading the API printer, and then we'll go into hiding individual keys. All right, and we're making good time. Good. All right, so let's go here. This is the Noun project, and what I actually want to look at is the sample code. All right, so I can go ahead and grab this, or actually I could grab this. I'm not going to need anything from my templates anymore for the time being. Everything will now come from my view. So in my views, I want to import both of these libraries, but Django is going to tell me that there's a problem because these libraries don't exist. All right, so to fix that, I'm going to actually install them using pip. So that installed request. And that installed request uplib, right? So now when I run the server again, I get no errors, and both libraries are now inside of my project.
What was the first thing that you installed?
Requests.
Okay, request and then a specific type of request.
Yeah, so here I'll send it over on the chat. So installed requests first, and then OAuth lib. Perfect. So now let's actually go into working with the API itself. So here it gives me an example. Right, so I could just grab that as well and bring it in. And for now, I'm gonna actually comment out this print statement. And we see your API key and your API secret key, right? So now I want to make sure that I can change that. So I'm gonna grab this. So here's my key. Copy it. All right. And now here's my secret key. Perfect. So that's going to take care of my authentication. So we did use pip freeze now. It will show requests as dependency. Yes, it would. So now pip freeze requirements .txt. All right, spelling's good. Okay. Da-da-da. So we see Django here. We see request, and we see request OAuth lib. Awesome. All right, so now in that OAuth one, oh, send it. I heard somebody talking. We all good? Okay. So now here in OAuth one, we see that we have the API key. And now I replace the secret key with my secret key so that I could actually make my request. Perfect. So now we see the endpoint here. So endpoint, the only thing that I want to change is I want to turn this into an F string. And I want to make sure that I'm grabbing what I'm actually looking for, right? So we already printed item title, and we know that it's actually grabbing the correct information. So I'm going to include it in here. So that takes care of our endpoint, and now we could actually go into the response so that we can see it. So we grab requests. We want to send a GET request. And we're going to reference endpoint. And then auth is going to be equal to auth. And now we could print response. All right, so let's see what that looks like. Server's not running. Let's run the server. Refresh this. All right, so there's our response. Boom. All of that is our response. So one, this may look like we can already access the dictionary, but if you guys notice at the beginning, we see this B and then the quotation marks. That means that all of this is coming, all this information is coming back in bits. It's not JSON, it's not JSON yet. So I can't use JSON things such as treating it like a dictionary just yet. Does anyone have an idea on how to turn it into JSON readable?
Is there a magical built-in JSON parser?
Yeah. So we'll just import JSON, right? And what we're going to actually do is we're going to do, let's see, response content and make that into JSON loads and then response.content.
Thank God.
Yeah. And now if we run this and I refresh it, we see that that B in quotation marks is gone. So now I have to actually access this like a dictionary. But it's still pretty ugly, right? Being able to read this type of dictionary and the structure is unpleasant. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually use pPrettier to be able to work with this. So let's see.
Sorry, can you please explain line 16?
Line 16.
So you're
Yes.
doing endpoint auth is equal to auth.
Of course. So auth is something that's going to be automatic. Auth, I should have named this something different. Let me see. Authentication. Auth stands for authentication. And what it's asking here, when you run a request.get, it knows that the second argument could be an authentication setting, right? And in this case, when we look at our documentation, and we know that for our authentication setting, what we need is to run OAuth1 with the API key along with our secret API key. So all we're doing is telling this that the authentication method will be OAuth1 with the API key and then our secret key. And then the endpoint is obviously just the actual URL that we're going to be pinging to access the API. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course, no problem. Oh, I was just about to go into pPrettier, our pprint. So let's do that real quick. And I believe we don't need to install pprint, but let's do it anyway. Yeah, so pprint's not something that we install. It's something that we just bring in. So we're gonna bring in import pprint, and that way we'll be able to use it. And what we're gonna actually do is we're gonna change the settings of pprint by giving it some, I guess, default information of what we want to do. All right, so we're gonna create our own kind of alias. So we know that Python actually is running Python 3, right? When I type in Python, it's not just running Python, it goes Python 3 and then runs what I want it to do. So now here, what I'm doing is I'm creating this variable and I'm giving it some default settings for Pretty Printer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the indentation and the depth of what I actually want to be able to see of this dictionary that comes back. So now instead of printing it, what I want to do is I want to actually use Pretty Printer to print it. So I'm going to use pp.pprint and I'm going to use response.content, right? And now when I send this information, we see that our dictionary came back in a much better format, right? So we see the icon, we see the indentation, which is 2 tabs of indentation, which is what we gave it. And then it tells me the depth that it'll go into. So it's going to go in 2 levels of depth. So it goes in 1, and then inside of the dictionary, it shows me the second key value for the depth of the dictionary. Does that make sense so far? Okay, great. So now that I'm able to use this, I know that I want to grab is the preview URL. So at this point, I'm just basically traversing a dictionary, right? So the first key that I want to go into is obviously, so I'll have you guys walk me through how do I get this preview URL extrapolated from this response.
You use square brackets, quotation mark. I'm sorry, what was the top one? Can you go up a little bit? Yeah, icon. And then again, use square brackets, quotation marks, accessing preview URL.
All right, so let's see. I refresh it. And here we see the preview URL. Nice. Does anyone have any questions over how we did that? Awesome. So now I have the preview URL and it's the image that I want to actually display. How do I send this URL over to the front end? So I guess first, let's actually set that to a variable, right? So how do I send this URL over to the template so that I can display it in an image tag?
You can take that image URL you just made and put it inside the data object.
Okay. So inside data object.
Just call it, yeah.
So you could use dot notation with such a thing as objects, which come from how do I explain it if I'm speaking Python? So with classes, you can use dot notations, right? But when you're just going into a dictionary structure, which is just a dictionary, you're gonna actually have to use square brackets. Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, thanks.
So image and then image URL. All right, and now I want to see it here. So I'm going to do img source, and then here I want image URL. And then I'm going to close it. Okay, so it's broken. Let's see, why is it broken? So let's go back to the views, and that's why it's broken. So I tried calling it image URL, but I actually named it image as a key. So when I was trying to reference it in my source, it was telling me, hey, this doesn't exist. So it was broken. Now that I fixed it and I'm calling the correct key, we see the icon populate, and now we got the car. And that's perfect. Cool. So now if I want to look up anything else, Mexico populates. Anyone got a noun you want me to look up?
Dog.
Dog. And there's our dog. Cool. So that's working with the Noun API. So just to clarify what's actually happening, we run everything, goes to our URLs, goes to an empty path, renders views home. We see home. We see views home, and then views home renders the noun form. We go to the noun form, we get that input field, right? So now we put in something into the input field. When we click look, it sends a post request into the item URL. So it goes into item, sends the post request here, which then sends us to the views of item. So now we go into the views of item. We grab what's inside of this input field. All right, so we grab what's inside of the input field, which is just dog in this case. We create our authentication method. We specify our endpoint. We send the actual request using the request library. We turn it JSON readable so that we could actually work with it. And then we use Pretty Prettier to traverse through the dictionary. And I'm actually going to comment that out for now. After that, we grab the image URL from the dictionary. And in the data, what we send back to this template, we send the item title and the image URL. So then item just replaces this H3 tag with the actual title that we put into the input field. And then the image URL renders as an image. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
In the okay, so in the views.py file for the
Yes.
app. Okay, so in the render, right, the render function request, is that being passed into pages item.html as well?
The request itself.
Yeah,
Okay.
is that being passed in?
No, so the request itself isn't being passed into the pages HTML. It's using request as the first argument, as in knowing that there was a request for this item, right? So whenever I send, how do I demonstrate that? Okay, so here you go. So when I load it, we see that there's been a post request that's been sent to this item URL, right? So once that request is actually being made, this condition gets met. So in the first one, if I refresh it, what we get is an actual get request, right? Once I put in car,
I'm sorry. That all makes 100%. I'm just wondering if in the item.html, that request object is accessible. So I can double square brackets request.post.get in the actual template itself.
I don't believe so. So the way that I would say to reference request is kind of just reference as if it was self. Does that make sense? But we
Yeah, I
can,
was just wondering why it was being passed in the render then, like it's being passed through. I'm just wondering if it's being passed through to the template. And I know you wouldn't really want to do anything with that because most of it you want to do in your view.
Mhm.
But if you wanted to access the variables like item in the template because request is in the render function.
Gotcha.
That's what I'm trying to get at, is like use it similar to the data function being passed into index or item.html. But it looks like the request object is being passed through as well to the render function.
I see what you're saying. So think, you guys already finished OOP week. Think of request as the equivalent of self when you're working with OOP, right? So if I take off request and I try to send this information now, it's going to tell me that there's an error. Because the path doesn't make sense. It doesn't know what to reference. So now when I send a request in, it's just telling it using self, render all of this information, right? The only things that we can access from the actual template, or the only things that are being passed into the template, is the data dictionary. And any information that gets passed between front end and back end will always be in a dictionary format for Python or an object format for JavaScript.
Cool, awesome, just checking. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Francis,
Yeah, of course.
I had one question just on the noun form HTML file, and this is just my unfamiliarity with like different methods and whatnot. You call out form method equals post here. So we're
Yes.
saying the form is going to fire off a post request, and then in views.py on line 14, when you declare that item title, you call out that it's again a post method. Is that just sort of like linking the two? Is it just that specificity, required for that? Like, what's the point of calling out post again?
So the point of saying post is because I'm telling it to go into the post of the request. So if this was a put instead of a post, in order to be actually able to get the item value, I would have to replace this post with put. Does that make sense?
Okay, I think so. So it's just calling out like, okay, inside that request, there's a specific call of type here post that we need to grab from that item name or that named item.
Yeah, exactly.
And now would be a good time to take a 10 or 15.
I'm tracking. Yeah, I'm working on it. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm not sure if that's your actual name. Is that your actual name? Dinosaur? Dinosaur? Is
No.
oh okay. All right. Well, awesome. Let's take a 14-minute break and just come back at 10:20 for everybody. See you guys later, guys.
Don't forget to pause the recording or stop it.
I'm doing that.
Stop it. It'll make a new file when you.
All right. So here's the API documentation, and what we looked at prior to kind of just gave us the example, and it was just the getting started format. But here's the actual, I guess, docs. If you look into the collection, we see the collection comes with a little bit of different information, right? But it's still only one. Now, if we look into the collection and the icons inside each individual collection, then we start getting an array of dictionaries. All right, so there's that. We could also pass in a string if we didn't want to use an integer ID. That would give us the same thing. So now we go into collections, gives us an array of collections. And this is more of what we're using, where we're looking for one icon, right? And this one icon, we're not passing an integer ID. Instead, what we actually passed in was a string as a parameter or term. So here's the parameter term, it's a string, and then icon term. So we pass it in, we see the dash icon / globe. So if we look here, and then just to make sure everybody could hear me, right? I totally just went in there without making sure everyone can, okay, perfect. Yeah, so we look here, we see the noun project / icon, and then the title of it, right? So we know that I'm actually pinging this specific request. I'm running a GET request, and what it's expecting to return to me is actually just one, whichever one is most fitting to the actual word that I'm sending. So if I go here and I refresh this, we see the attribution, which is car by et cetera. What it does is it actually runs a GET request to its own database. You guys already worked with queries, and it just asks us to grab the first, it grabs the first item where car is inside of that item, right? So we see that we get the ID of 72. I'm sure if we type in some other type of car, let me see. Can anyone think of a car? Let's run the Mustang, the Boot Sting.
Miata.
Say again. I might have sent it too early. I'm sorry. Now we know that Mustang is a car, right? But now when we look at the ID, it's completely different than the other one. It's a lot further down the line. This one's 72. This one's 3,000 something. And we also see that car isn't actually included in it. I'm sure it's somewhere in association. It might tell you always the answer. I'm sure that if we look up car, we will see the Mustang somewhere in there if we start actually going through it. But if we just look up car, what it's going to do is going to return the first instance with the, I guess, lowest integer ID. Does that answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, it's I guess it's just a weird system. But,
Yes. Yeah, so if I looked up icons with multiple, I can actually tell it a specific limit and kind of where to look for it. And when I send that specific thing, then I'll get multiple results for that API. So this is where the reading the documentation comes into play and knowing exactly what you're querying, right? And what's happening with this API whenever you send some type of parameter. Corresponding the tags array of the Mustang response. Probably. Yeah, let me see. Oh, well, I would have to open that up. All right. Cool. So now to pick up where we left off from, what we're going to be going over now is actually just hiding those keys. Because right now we have everything, all those keys available. But if I push this up to GitHub, then going through the entire trouble of only pinging this through the back end would be defeated, right? Because now someone can go to my GitHub repository and they could see all of these keys being in there. So now let's hide them real quick. We have our noun project, don't really need this anymore. But now what I'm gonna do, so I'm in my parent folder. We see that we have static here. And have you guys used Vim yet? I think that is a no. All right, we're gonna make a .env and we're gonna make a gitignore. All right, so this .env is specifically so that we can put any type of environmental variables in there. And our gitignore, we can tell it things that we don't want GitHub to know exist. Oh, damn, that's rough, man. You're a real one. Stuck in Vim. Oh no. All right, so now that we put the .env in there, whenever I go to actually run a commit message or an add with GitHub, my env is not going to be included. All right, so now in this .env, I can actually start putting things that I want to hide. So I know there's a Django key that I want to hide. I know there's an API key that I want to hide. And there's a secret key that I would also like to hide. So now I'm going to grab all three of those variables and install them. But first, I want to make sure that I grab that python.env library. So let's install that real quick. So pip install. All right, so now we have python.env and I want to freeze this again. I believe I did. Yeah, right, .env. Oh, and also the env folder. Yes, you're correct. Thank you. Appreciate it. But I actually went to the back one. There you go. All right. Sorry, I kind of lost my brain thought. Oh yeah, into requirements txt. And now if I look at my requirements txt, we'll see. No, where did you go? There it is. Python.env is now included in my requirements. Awesome. So now I'm going to go into settings because that's the first thing that I want to change. And let me clean this up so that we don't have too much noise here. All right, so let's go into the settings. And in the settings, we have the security warning right here. So keep the secret key used in production secret. So we want to make sure that this is actually a secret key. So we're going to import OS. And then we're going to say from.env, we're going to import load.env. And load.env is just a method that you can call on a file. And once the method is called on a file, then it's just going to be you'll be able to actually pull things from your env from anywhere in the file. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this into my .env. And I'm going to use OS to grab it. All right, so now I'm telling it Django. So what I'm saying is I'm going to use OS. I'm going to go into my environment so it knows that it's going to .env. And then I'm giving it the key of Django to grab the value from there. So now when I go ahead and run my server, it will compile just fine. It won't give me an issue. All my GET requests are working. Whereas prior to, if I had an invalid key, we would see that when I go to refresh this, we see a server error occurred. All right, so now let's hide the other things that we want to hide. We want our API key and our secret key.
Can I ask a question about something in the settings?
Yeah, of course.
Can you go back to the settings real quick?
Yes.
Yeah, so I noticed that you're using the OS library, but I don't see where .env comes in. Because you imported .env and then called load.env. But what does that do if you just used os.environ to get the Django variable from the .env folder or file?
Yeah, so let's try it out. Let's see. So this load.env is supposed to make it available for us to actually be able to use. Yeah, see? There you go. So there's the problem. If I try to use os.environ, it's gonna freak out and it's gonna tell me that it can't just go into your environment process, right? Because it doesn't know how to load it correctly with Python. So instead, what we do is we bring in the .env library from python.env and we run the load.env. So then that way it knows that it's supposed to treat it as if it were just a dictionary, go into the environment and then grab the Django key. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious about what's happening with load.environment and but I think I'll just look into the docs.
Yeah. Let's see. I'll pass this link over in the chat so that if you want to take a look at it. Okay, perfect. So now we know that's working, and now we want to go ahead and move the rest of the things from our views, right? So now we're going to go to our views. This is my API key. And then I want to bring in my secret key as well. All right, and same thing, I'm gonna want to import OS and then bring in .env and load.env. Oh. Okay, perfect. And now let's fix this real quick. So we want os.environ, and here we want API key. And then just to make sure that that's what I call them, secret key, API key, secret key. Perfect. If I go refresh this, it works. Let's send car over. And we see that we have a problem. So we see expecting value, line 1, column 1 is blah, blah, blah. It's not exactly telling me what the problem here is. So let's see if we can figure it out together. Do some decoder. Okay, let's see if I crash it and run it again. There you go. So I just needed a hard reset. So crash the server, reran the server. It was able to read the env file and bring in my secret and API keys. So now the git ignore knows that it's not supposed to touch the .env, and then I'm telling it to go one directory back and not touch my env as well. And I believe that is all the points that we have for today. Okay, so we went over working with forms, we went over request and OAuth, we went over how to read the API with Pretty Printer, and we've just covered how to hide and load secret keys. Perfect. So I guess
quick question. Is that kind of like the industry standard for security as far as keys like that go? Is that what everybody does?
Yes, so whenever you want to hide keys, it has to go inside a .env. Since this isn't going to get pushed up into GitHub, what you can do sometimes is you could create a template. Right, and inside this template, we see that it doesn't really know what it's supposed to be, but inside here we can say that it's got to reference something like this. It's going to need a API key and a secret key. All right, so this will be the actual template that gets pushed up to GitHub. That way, if another developer or anyone else needs to pull this project down or this branch down and work on it themselves, they can use this template to build their own .env and ensure that it matches correctly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and is that how like some security breaches happen? Like some dumbass junior developer named Dave accidentally doesn't put the .env into git ignore?
I'm not sure. I'm sure it happens for many reasons, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the friction points with new software engineers.
Yeah.
Could you gloss over real quick? What was the last thing you had to pip install? What was that last library? Was it env something?
It's python-env. This one.
And what is that actually giving us? Is it just using the .env file correctly, basically?
Yeah, it gives us the ability to use .env, the library. So this is installing the .env library for Python specifically. There's .envs for other type of languages, but this one gives us the one for Python. This way, whenever we actually go to call it, so we can now go into the .env library and we can grab the load.env method that we can call our document. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I
Okay.
guess I'm with Chase. I'm gonna read more about that load.env because that's strange. But yeah, okay. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, does anyone have any questions at this point, or is there anything that I could maybe help clarify that you guys may have questions on over the last couple of lessons? Or I could just let you guys go and you guys could just head off straight into your assignments for the day. Whichever you guys would prefer.
I'm personally ready to kind of do assignments, see what questions still have.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Then I'll be available on.
No, I was gonna say half of the class do the assignments and then the other half you could just go over everything again. Since we have like another hour.
That is true. You guys do have another hour. Let me see what we can do here. Damn, I went through that pretty quickly. I gotta slow down for the next lesson. My apologies, guys. Well, I hope it was good though.
Yes,
When will the code be available that you wrote?
As soon as I stop sharing, I will be able to push it over to the actual demos and notes, and then everyone can actually be using it. And then I'll get it uploaded in YouTube as soon as possible. I just got to put timestamps on the recording so that you guys could easily maneuver through it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and then let me actually stop recording. Good point. Thank you.